question, right? If a law is not enforced, is it truly a law? And part two to that is, if you have no enforcement mechanism, is it really a law to begin with at all? Now, we're used to having a police and other enforcement mechanisms, but what about internationally? Now, again, we're talking about sovereign states. Is there an international police? Now, historically, no. Is there now? Not really, but you could look at the United Nations, peacekeeping operations, that kind of thing. But nevertheless, that's another fundamental difference between domestic law and international law, is that within domestic law, we have enforcement mechanisms, the court systems, the police systems, the administrative, like the IRS and that kind of thing, built into our systems, where on an international level, we don't really have that. And again, this goes back to sovereignty. If another country could tell another country what to do, they're not really sovereign, unless that country agrees to limit its power. So, who enforces international law? How is it enforced? Any ideas? What's the first thing you think of when I ask who enforces international law? I know what I think of. First thing, headquartered in New York. United Nations, right? Do they enforce international law? That's a theoretical question too, but sort of, kinda. Later on, we're going to talk about Article 41 and 42 of the United Nations Charter. That's where the Security Council is given some ability to enforce international law. But again, it's fundamentally different. That's the point I'm making. It's fundamentally different than domestic law because we don't really have that enforcement mechanism. So a country may be violating a treaty that they agreed to, they signed all the papers on it, and then they may not follow it. And so, how is that enforced? Now, historically, how was international law enforced? Going back to the city-states of Italy. If Milan was violating a treaty and Venice and Florence didn't like what Milan was doing, what would they do? They'd go invade, right? They'd force the rule on them through military force. Now, one of the fundamental concepts we're also going to talk about is the historical change in how international law enforcement is viewed post-World War I and post-World War II, which were really the drivers of sort of this whole concept of the rule of law versus rule of force, which we'll get into later. But that's another theme throughout this term. That is the idea of sovereigns agreeing to create what is sort of an international enforcement mechanism through various means, either militarily, economically, through trade sanctions, or other mechanisms to enforce rules against a sovereign that is not following international law, including international court systems, which historically never existed. So, this idea of enforcement is another fundamental difference between international law and domestic law, but also at the core of this whole concept of a sovereign limiting its own power because it benefits from doing so. And we'll talk about different enforcement mechanisms both privately and publicly, like an International Court of Justice. Within the World Trade Organization, they have developed enforcement mechanisms for violation of trade rules. Within international private transactions, we have international arbitration. So we have a lot of different enforcement mechanisms now that historically we didn't have. And that's one of the themes, is creating these non-use of force methods to enforce international law, rather than just resorting to military power all the time. Again, post-World War I, post-World War II. All right, so I don't know the answer to this question. I wish I did. If a law is not enforced, is it still a law? I guess that just sort of depends, right? So let's go back to the example I gave you earlier. let's say it's the 1800s or 1700s, doesn't really matter, but a ship from my country was taken by the Navy from another country in international waters without justification. They just went and took it, seized the ship. So the owner of the ship comes back to me, let's say I'm the ruler of my country, and says, hey, you need to go get my ship back from this other country, or you need to make them pay for the value of my ship. So in other words, the ship was owned by a private person within my country. They came to me as the governing body and said, they took my ship, what are you going to do about it? You're the government. So now I have, as the government, I have an analysis I have to make, right? If I don't take action against this other country that seized the ship of one of my country's people, then they will probably keep doing that because they know there won't be a repercussion. But on the other hand, I don't necessarily want to start a war over a fishing boat that was seized. So you have this, as a sovereign, you have this balancing analysis you have to make. If I go out and take action to either recover the ship or go seize one of their ships, in response, that may lead to military conflict. Now, obviously, historically, if I had a more military or physical capability, militarily speaking, I would just go out and take the ship back and take a few of their ships just to boot. But if we are roughly militarily equal, I may not want to risk a war or loss of economic relationships and trade or whatever may be the consequence by going and trying to get that ship back. And so this is a problem. That is, the idea historically is sovereigns essentially didn't have anywhere to go to work out their disputes, other than they could try to work it out between themselves by exchanging diplomats and ambassadors, or they could essentially resort to physical force. So one of the themes, again, throughout the term is going to be, let's create mechanisms, both on a global level, but also on a private level, that allows for disputes to be resolved without force, through legal trials or forums or whatever. And we'll talk about that more later on. All right, so I think we are going to break there because I don't want to start the now. We have 5 minutes left. So let's break there for today.